Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted and privileged to welcome once again a very accomplished author from Pittsburgh, USA, Mr. Michael Couch. Michael, welcome to the show.
Ashutosh, great to be back. Great to see you.
Thank you. Michael, amongst a lot of other things, is an author, and today we're going to speak about his book, which he has co-authored. The book is titled Strategy-Driven Leadership, the Playbook for Developing Your Next Generation of Leaders. So, Michael, let's get straight into the book.
Sure.
And before I ask you the first question, I'm going to ask our viewers and listeners to go and check out Mr. Michael Couch's book, Strategy-Driven Leadership, the Playbook for Developing Your Next Generation of Leaders. So tell me a little bit about your own background and how you came to focus on leadership development and strategy.
Yeah. Well, my background many years ago, my education was in industrial and organizational psychology. And, as most careers go, you sort of fall into things. And one of my first assignments for a large steel company was to figure out how to select and develop leaders much better than they had in the past. So right off the start, that was a focus of my career, and it's just something I've paid attention to in my corporate life. And then when I decided to start my own practice, that was an area I felt that I could really make a contribution to, and had learned a lot about it. Many things changed over those years from when I started. So
very interesting. And give me a brief overview of your book, Strategy-Driven Leadership.
Yeah. So my co-author, Dr. Richard Citron, is a clinical psychologist, and my background was industrial and organizational psychologist. But when we ran into each other when we were starting our practices back in 2007, we really started comparing notes about what works and what doesn't work in leadership development. And unfortunately, what we looked into and the evidence and research we did, a lot of it doesn't work. At least in the United States, we spend billions of dollars on leadership development, and there's very little evidence that much of it has an impact. So what we decided to do was to summarize that and to come up with some guidance for organizations on how to do a much better job of identifying and developing their leaders, and really focusing on evidence-based practices, because there's always something new or different that pops up, and most of it isn't helpful. So that we decided to summarize that in our book, Strategy-Driven Leadership. So that is sort of a summary of the research around what's effective, and then also some guidance on how to go about and implementing, and also for individuals, the leaders themselves, what they can think about to learn and develop as leaders.
Fascinating. And Michael, you also speak about retooling prior leadership efforts. Can you explain this to my viewers and listeners and give me an example if possible?
Yeah, so that's when we looked at leadership development, we found so much didn't work. So we figured, well, we really have to change what's going on here. Probably one of the biggest things we saw is that most leadership development wasn't created in a context, and isn't focused on, why are we doing this? And many times we ask people, why are you doing this leadership development? They say, well, I don't know. But from our standpoint, it starts with strategy. So to retool leadership development, it begins with thinking about strategy, thinking about what are the capabilities you need in your leaders to help drive the strategy, and then how you can build a pipeline to be able to continue to drive strategy through the capability of your leaders. So that's what we meant by retooling. It's sort of from the time you start hiring and developing leaders to the point where you move them into new positions. All those things we think need to be tweaked and retooled.
Yeah, well said. And how do you define next generation of leaders?
So that's there's a lot of information and talk in the media about the differences between generations.
Yeah.
What we find is most of that research isn't very good, and we're more alike than we are different. So what we find out is all adults, no matter where they are, learn the same way. So the what you need to do to begin in a career and start a new generation of leaders developing is the same thing you need to do to help older folks later in their career continue to develop. So we don't like to focus on generational differences as much as we like to focus in on what is effective in terms of building the skills and ability needed to be a leader. And those are the same. Research shows that globally, the set of capabilities and competencies that leaders need to be effective are very similar. Cultural changes are different, but the skill requirements, and you've worked in all those different cultures. You've worked in the United States, and you worked in India and brought businesses to India, and your experiences that built the capabilities you needed to be successful are the same as you would need in Europe. So that's the way we approach it.
Well said. And my next question, Michael, is that what are some of the common mistakes organizations make when it comes to leadership development?
Yeah. Well, we actually talk about 5 epic failures in leadership development. That first one is context. And that was really highlighted by Peter Drucker, who really emphasized around leadership development. And he would keep saying, well, leadership for what purpose? So for us, it's strategy. The other thing is that a lot of people look at leadership development as an event, go to a workshop or have a retreat or do something like that. What we talk about is that the development needs to be built into work, not bolted on as something extra you do, because you learn every day from the things you do. So that idea of staying away from events, building things in, not bolting them on, and also focusing on evidence. There's so many new, bright, shiny objects that pop up, or a new book gets written, people change their approach. Well, that tends not to work. So those are the kind of of epic fails that we see in leadership, and it doesn't take too much to change that. And it's actually, we find in many cases, less of an investment if you think about development as something that goes on regularly. But we talk about making development intentional. So we're all learning every day, but making sure that the experiences that we're going through, that we're intentionally learning something critical from those experiences and then applying it, seeing how it works, and then keep going. So development is an ongoing thing. It's not an event. It's not the latest book, but context around strategy is very important.
Great response. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And my next question to you is that what skills or attributes should organizations prioritize in developing their next generation of leaders? And when I'm now talking next generation, I'm talking about our millennials and the Gen Zs who have now got into positions of influence and authority.
Yes. Yeah. So the, excuse me, a little bit of a cold here this morning. The interesting thing is that the skills are very similar. No matter where you are and no matter what you're doing. So we like to talk about the idea that it's probably like a consultant's answer. It depends, and in this case, it depends on strategy. So what it might take for a consumer-based retail business, the skills and abilities of leaders and the strategy that they're trying to accomplish there would be very different from a business-to-business manufacturing leadership. So it depends on strategy, and then converting what you know about strategy, what that's going to demand of your organization and leaders, and then focusing on developing those strategy critical competencies that are going to help drive strategy. So it's back to that idea of strategy first.
And therefore, that kind of logically now takes me to the next question. What, in your view, is the relationship between strategy and leadership as you see it?
Yeah, obviously, it's tightly linked. So it's always a question: what comes first? For us, we often focus on culture as well. Because an organization's culture is very critical. So understanding that relationship between the behaviors of leaders and its impact on culture is very critical. We find that probably to be the #1 impact. The determinant of an effective culture in a business is the the behavior of leaders.
Mm.
So the idea of having a strong link between between those two, and and strategy again, and culture being the core foundation of those.
Mm. My next question is that, Michael, the whole world is now going through a significant change
Yes.
because of technology.
Mm.
There is technology, there is the future of work, there is hybrid work practices, and so many new things are happening in the environment. My first question relating to this is, how is technology changing leadership and strategy?
Yes, I mean, obviously, strategy. If you're not thinking about technology as a component of your
Mm,
your strategic planning, you're missing something.
mm, mm,
But we're also see some real opportunities, with new technology to help in leadership development and coaching.
mm,
Having a tool right with you that can maybe, whoops, it's not showing up that well, but
mm,
your
yeah.
your phone as and apps as a tool to help in coaching
Mm,
and in help in reminders and making development more intentional. There's some interesting things, going on there in terms of just the practice of
mm,
of intentional development. But again, I think it also is back to that approach of what does technology mean in our strategy, and what does that mean for the behavior of leaders? I think probably one of the biggest impacts we've seen is the move to hybrid work.
mhm,
Leaders need to think about and change their behavior and capabilities for particularly to sustain a clear and aligned culture while people
mm,
are working all over the world remotely. Again, we're back to, we are not only talk about intentional leadership development, but
mm,
intentional culture development and culture improvement and movement.
mm, mm. And how can some of the principles that you have outlined in your book help organizations navigate challenges? And one of the big challenges we've just come out of, I hope, has been the global pandemic.
Yes, that's very interesting. We did a lot of research during the before and after the pandemic to see what the impacts were there, and the interesting thing is that the organizations that invested in effective leadership development prior to any significant challenge, came
Mm,
through it much better. We had one executive say, "Boy, I'm glad we we invested in leadership development in our culture work
mhm,
prior to the pandemic because we had to take a withdrawal from our culture bank," as
mm,
as she put it.
mm,
So the you don't know what the next challenge is going to be. Something's going to come along. Having a good pipeline of agile and capable leaders is very
mm,
important to help with any challenge that might befall your
mm,
company. And we
mm.
find that investment to be very, very important, very capable. As things change.
Interesting. Uh, my next question is, that, for the small and medium enterprises,
Yeah.
you know, I've often seen that a lot of principles that are outlined are very big, are very good for large organizations.
Yes. Yeah.
My question to you is, how can small businesses or startups apply the principles of strategy driven leadership?
Yeah, so that's part of what we found in our research and our development of particularly intentional leadership development
Mm,
is, um, you know, if you're a large organization, you could spend millions and billions on events and
mm,
programs and
mm,
content.
mm,
Our approach is that development should be built into the work every day.
mm,
So we work with clients as small as, 40, 50 people up to, 20, 30,000 employees.
mm,
And we find that the principles can be applied. And it's mostly, again, being intentional. So if you're going to bring a leader into a new role, uh, not only, think about, how do you can help them, but what are they going to learn from the new role?
mm,
And particularly for folks that you see potential in for the future, giving them, challenges that can help get them ready to be a, higher level leader. You can do
mm,
that with an organization of any size. It doesn't take
mm,
a huge HR department with a huge learning and development function. It helps sometimes, but it's just thinking about the intentionality of the experiences that you're putting leaders through. Also, small organizations could be better at being coaches. So
mm,
leaders ought to really be thinking about the role they play as a coach. And it's not a cheerleader, rah, rah, and it's not a professor telling people what to do, but it's
Mm,
helping leaders learn from the experiences you're going through and connecting them. So
mm,
we also see that networks, no matter what size your organization is, your network and the effectiveness of your network is key to your successes in your career.
mm, mm,
So thinking about helping new leaders and new executives build connections internally and especially externally.
mm,
You don't need a huge investment to do that. It's just thinking about it, planning it, and there's that word again,
mm.
intentional
Yeah,
about it.
yeah, yeah. And if you were to reverse the positioning, and my question being, you've been telling me about what we can do for leaders, but what can an individual working in an organization do to be able to adapt to a strategy driven leadership mindset?
Yeah, and when we do individual coaching, this is what
Mm,
we work with individuals on too. Is again, it's back to what experiences have you had?
mm,
What have you learned or what you didn't learn about it and why?
mm,
What worked? What was effective? So we view development as something that occurs regularly, and building a cadence of development. So it's
mm,
something that you can work on every week. We have one executive who on his Outlook calendar on Friday put 5 minutes at 5 o'clock on Friday. And what he did at those 5 minutes and say, all right, what did I do this week?
mhm,
How did that go? What worked? What didn't? What do I have coming up next week or in the next few weeks that I really got to think about how I approach that? And
mm,
so, spending time on it, being reflective. So, and asking for feedback. So we're finding that those two pieces, getting good, honest feedback from others,
mhm.
and being in a role where you're asking for feedback, it's not imposed on you,
Yeah.
and also spending good time in reflection on
Mm,
experiences you've had and what you've developed from that. Any individual can do that.
mm,
And that we talk about that in the book, and we had the whole section on intentional leadership development is something
mm.
a learning and development function can implement or help implement. It's also what an individual leader can do on their
Right,
own.
right. Well said. So I have time for two more questions for you. My
Yes.
next question is, can you offer some practical advice for companies looking to develop their leadership in line with their strategic goals?
Yeah, so I've and might lead into sort of a good example
Hmm.
of this is we had a large growing client who was interested in culture. And so they did an assessment of their culture, which is often where it
Mm,
suggests that people begin. And they identified, 7 or 8 components of culture that they realized were critical to their implementing their strategy in the
mm,
future.
mm,
Because they saw growth, they were moving geographically, they saw technology
mm,
changing. And so we worked with them to do an assessment of their leadership pipeline. And they picked small teams of folks who they thought would be high potential leaders.
mm,
And they assigned them one of those components of culture to go out and find out what works. In
mm,
some cases, they looked globally, they traveled and talked with companies, and they came back. But they also said, while you're doing this, we want you to learn to be a better leader.
mm,
So what skills are you going to pick up by doing this? And what
mm,
insights? And so they did those parallel paths of culture effectiveness and leadership development.
mhm,
And at the end, they ended up with probably 75 recommendations in which they prioritized. And, the CEO at the time said, boy, that was fantastic. Not only did we come up with some things that they're still implementing today, and
mhm,
this was probably 8 years ago. He said, we not only, built a foundation for the future, but we built leaders. And we
mm,
probably, and from there on, they really latched on to this idea of learning from experience and intentional development as the way
mm,
they approach
mm, mm.
leadership development. So that's the kind of thing is, if you're going to go
Interesting.
through strategy work and culture work, don't forget that it's one of the biggest development activities you can go through
Mm,
with leaders. So make it inclusive, bring in lots of people, listen to different ideas
mm.
and different areas of your business, but use it as a learning opportunity as well.
Very interesting. And my last question to you, Michael, and this is for the many people who will listen to our conversation. What would you say are three lessons you would want a lot of startup entrepreneurs or founders to keep at the back of their mind when it comes to strategy-driven leadership?
Yeah, so strategy, of course, in many, you've got a good business plan
Mhm,
in many cases, and it has
mhm,
great, financial and technology or whatever components to it. But
mhm,
don't forget the leadership and talent component too.
mhm.
So as an entrepreneur, you're so focused on the product
Yeah.
many times and the financing of getting it there.
Mhm,
But make sure you take time to sit back and look at your team.
mhm,
We did a lot of work with private equity firms
mhm,
over the years, and they ended up at times saying, what we acquire, in terms of the business, we're often looking for the leaders,
mhm,
as much as the business and the product itself.
mhm.
So that's I think as I'm probably not adding up to three here,
Mhm.
but
No,
I
that's
think
okay.
yeah, the idea that your team is probably just is much more important in many cases than
Mhm,
entrepreneurs often
mhm,
realize, and make sure you spend the time and effort thinking about who you're bringing on, and then learn together. Taking time to pull back,
yeah.
take a breather and say, all right, what did we do? Is it working? Is it or is it not? What do we learn in that? And now how are we going to really leverage this to grow our business in the way that we
Mhm,
want it to?
mhm. And on that note, Michael, and your wonderful lessons, take time to look at your team. And second, you said, which is so important, and a lot of entrepreneurs forget, which is to learn together. Thank you so
Yes.
much for speaking to me about your book, Strategy Driven Leadership. We covered a lot of ground on very many different aspects of leadership and strategy in our conversation today. Thank
Thank
you for
you.
speaking to me, and good luck.
Yeah, it's always great talking with you, and have a great 2024.
Thank you, and you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the brand called You.